Hi and welcome. This is Mohammed Kubaib. Welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, we will discuss about how to configure Azure Backup for SQL DB deployed in Azure Virtual Machine using private and service endpoint. So basically, we will cover how we can achieve Azure Backup for SQL DB using service and private endpoint. Before we jumping into the concept of service or private endpoint, so let's see the backup architecture in Azure. So in this diagram, as you can see, we have a Azure virtual machine. So in this virtual machine, we have installed SQL Server, and then we have SQL DB. On the other side, we have a Azure Backup Service. So within the backup service, we have Recovery Service Vault. So Recovery Service Vault is the place where we will have our backup files, etc., stored. So when we enable Azure Backup for SQL VM or SQL DB, so basically Azure Backup Service will install a extension on the particular virtual machine. So the name of the extension is Azure Backup Windows Workload. So basically, this extension which consists of two things. One is called coordinator and another one is SQL plugin. So the job of the coordinator, it is responsible for configuring the backup, restore, etc. Whereas the plugin responsibility is for the actual data flow. The meaning of this is the coordinator which is responsible for any kind of policies, backup schedules, etc., etc. And the responsible of the plugin is basically to copy the data from the VM to the backup vault. So these are the responsibility of these two components, which basically comes with the extension. So in order to configure backup for the database should be discovered. So whatever the database within this virtual machine, first it should get discovered. To discover this, our extension will help for the discovery. So basically what extension will do, it will create a service account called Azure Backup Plugin SVC. So this is the service account it will create. So it will have SQL sysadmin permissions. So with the help of this service account, Azure Backup can discover the database within the virtual machine. So although it does not require any password management because it comes under anti-authority system account. So you don't need to worry about the password management, etc. In fact, password management is not at all required for this particular service account. Let's see the network connectivity requirement for Azure Backup for SQL. So when you configure Azure Backup for SQL, basically from your virtual machine, you should have connectivity to these services. For example, Azure Backup or Azure Storage and Microsoft Entra ID. So in order to understand this, for example, let's say you have a virtual machine here. So on this virtual machine, you have SQL running and you wanted to enable backup for this. So when you enable backup, so your VM should have a connectivity to the Azure backup service, and then you should have a connectivity of the storage. So because this is nothing but the recovery service old storage, so on which your backup will be saved. And then we have a connectivity requirement for the Entra ID. So this is for the authentication purpose. So basically, in order to allow the communication from your virtual machine towards these Azure services, basically these are all public facing services. So it means that the connectivity from here to here, it will go over the public internet. So this you can achieve using proxy, or you can directly allow it through the firewall. However, the communication still it will go over the public internet, which is not safe or secure. So in order to avoid these options, what you can do, you can make use of private endpoint and service endpoint. So private endpoint, what it will do, from your virtual machine to the Azure backup or Azure storage, it will directly flow over the Azure backbone, and it will reach directly to the services privately. So it won't travel through the public internet. So private endpoint, it is only supported here with Azure backup and Azure storage. However, Microsoft Entra ID is not supported with private endpoints. So that's where we are using service endpoint for Microsoft Entra ID and private endpoint for the backup and storage. So using these two options, you can securely allow the communication, and it will flow over the Azure backbone, so it will not create any security concerns. So this is how you can use private and service endpoint in order to configure Azure Backup for your SQL DB, and it will flow over the Azure backbone, and it will avoid traversing over the public internet. Let's see how to configure Azure Backup for SQL database. To start with, let's configure service endpoint. So in order to enable service endpoints, we need to identify our virtual machine and the subnet on which we have deployed the virtual machines. So if I go to my virtual machine here, so this is my SQL VM, so VM hyphen SQL DB. So let's go to this, and let's browse to the networking. So this is my virtual network and subnet, which is SQL demo vnet hyphen default. So I will browse to the subnet. So once we have the subnet blade here, so we need to select the subnet, and then we need to browse to service endpoint. So if you scroll down, you'll see an option called service endpoint. So now we need to enable service endpoint for our Azure Active Directory or Entra ID. So if you select the drop down, you'll see the first option, which is Microsoft Azure Active Directory. So the moment you enable this one on your subnet, all the communication to Azure Active Directory from the virtual machine, it will flow directly through the Microsoft backbone network. So if you do not enable this, then all the communication to Azure Active Directory, it will go over the public internet, either through proxy or firewall or NAT gateway, etc. So let's select save. So now we have configured service endpoint for our subnet, which is hosting the SQL virtual machine. So now we need to configure recovery service alt, and also we need to configure private endpoint for the recovery service alt. In order to configure recovery service alt, I will go to the recovery service blade. So here I will click on recovery service alt. So here under subscription, you can choose the subscription. So under resource group, you can choose the relevant resource group on which you wanted to host the recovery service alt. And let's give the name for the recovery service alt. I am going to give db hyphen backup hyphen recovery service alt. And the region, I'm going to select Central US because all my virtual machine network, everything is hosted in Central US. Accordingly, as per your infra, so you have to choose your region. So I'll go to next, redundancy. So here I wanted to keep locally redundant. So if you wanted to keep zone or geo redundant, select accordingly. So in my case, I'm keeping locally redundant. And then encryption. So either you can use Microsoft managed key or your own key. However, this is very important because once you configure this, later you cannot modify. So make sure that you do the changes in the initial phase only. And let's go to the world properties. So I'm not going to select anything here. I will keep it default. And coming into very important part, which is networking. So here either you can allow public access from all network or deny public access and allow private endpoint. So this we will configure later. For now, I will keep it by default, which is allow public access from all network. So I will click on next tags. So again, I will keep as it is, and then I will click on review and create. So this will create the backup recovery service alt. So once it is created, then we will configure the networking, which is private endpoint. So in order to create, so let's hit on create. So this will take some time, so let's wait for this. So the recovery service alt creation is completed now. So this is our recovery service alt. So let's configure the networking. So I will go to the networking blade, and then I will go to the private access, and then I will click on private endpoint. So now basically what we are doing, we are creating a private endpoint or private connection to our backup service as well as for the storage from the recovery service alt. So here under name, we need to give the name for our private endpoint. So I'm going to give recovery service vault db hyphen pe. So under region, I'll keep Central US, and then I'll go to next. So here under target sub resource, we need to select Azure Backup. Since we are doing this for the Azure DB backup, so we need to select Azure Backup as a target sub resource. So if you are doing for something else like Azure Site Recovery, etc., then accordingly you need to choose the relevant services. So since this demo is concentrating on Azure Backup, so we will choose sub resources Azure Backup, and then we'll click on virtual network. So here we need to select the virtual network for our private endpoint. So under virtual network, so this is my virtual network, which is SQL demo vnet, and then we need to select the subnet. So under this I have a subnet called default. So if you wanted to keep a separate subnet for your private endpoint, then you can do that. Since it is a demo, I am going to use the same subnet on which my SQL server is also deployed. So in a production infra, it is always recommended to keep a separate subnet for a private endpoint and separate subnet for the virtual machines. So under private IP configuration, you have two options. Either you can dynamically allocate a IP address to your private endpoint, or you can statically assign the IP address as well. So I will keep it a default option, which is dynamic, and then I will click on next. So this is very important, the DNS configuration part. So here you have multiple options. Either you can use Microsoft Azure private DNS zone, or you can host on your own DNS server by creating a forwarder, etc., or you can also configure host entry. So there are multiple methods are available to integrate with the private endpoint for the DNS resolution. So it is always recommended you use Microsoft private DNS zone instead of using other methods. So here you can see I have selected integrated with private DNS zone. I have clicked yes. So now you need to select on which subscription you wanted to deploy the private DNS zone. So since I have only one subscription, so by default it is selected, and also resource group. So if you wanted to change, you can change the resource group also. So here you can see it is creating a private DNS zone. See, if you see for the backup, it is creating private link.cus.backup.windows.azure.com. For the storage, it is creating two zones. One is queue storage and another one is the blob storage. So in a production infra, basically this will have a separate subscription to host the private DNS zone. However, since it is a demo, I am deploying everything in a single subscription. Then I will click on tags. So I'll keep default. So then I'll click on review and create. So once everything is reviewed, then we can hit on create to create the private endpoint for our recovery service vault. So the validation is passed. So I'm creating create. So this will take some time. So let's wait till it completes. So now the private endpoint configuration is completed. So let's go back to our recovery service vault. So this is our recovery service vault, and let's go to the networking part once again. And now we can choose public network access deny. So now what will happen? It will use private endpoint to connect to the Azure backup service. So once you select deny, then you can apply. So now our configuration is completed for the private endpoint as well. So now any traffic which is going from the VM to the recovery service vault or to the Microsoft Azure Active Directory, it will flow over the Microsoft backbone network instead of flowing over the public internet. Let's see the private endpoint configuration. So I'll go to the recovery service vault here, and then I'll go to the recovery service blade and networking, and then we'll go to the private access. So this is our recovery. So this is our private endpoint. So if you go to the private endpoint under DNS configuration, you can see there are A records created over here. So basically 10005, 10006. So all this has got DNS record. so accordingly. So for example, here you can see private link.cusbackup.windows.net, which is corresponding to 10.0.0.5 IP address. Similarly, with the 10.0.0.6 IP address also, we have the records. So if you wanted to check further, what we can do, we can go to the private DNS. So under private DNS also, we can verify the records. For example, if you go to the private DNS zone, there are three zones created: one for the backup and another for the storage. So which is Q and blob is for storage, and backup is the related to the backup private zone. So if you go to the backup, and if you see record sets, you can see a records over here, as you can see. So these are all a records entry over here related to the backup URLs. So now we have our recovery service alt, and under virtual machine, so this is my virtual machine which is having SQL DB. So if I log into this SQL DB, so here I'm going to launch the SQL Studio to connect to my database, just to show you my database on which I'm going to enable the backup. So let me connect. So in this SQL Server, I have a database called Citrix DB. So to which database I'm going to enable the backup. So if I go to properties, and if check the last backup status, it is showing none. Same goes for the log backup as well. So now let's go back to our recovery service alt, and we will configure the backup. So again, I'm going back to my Azure portal. So under recovery service alt, so I'm going to select my recovery service alt. So here we have option called backup items. So we need to select the backup item over here, so which is nothing but SQL database in Azure VM. So let it load. So here we need to add our SQL server. So let me select add. So here, where is your workload running, which is Azure. So what do you want to backup? So in my case, it is SQL server in Azure VM. So now the next step is we need to select start discovery. So for that, we need to click on this option. So here it will ask the virtual machine on which SQL is installed. So in this case, this is my SQL server. So I have to choose this one. So before I select a discover DB, so let me show you something over here under my SQL VM. So if I go to the VM and if I search for extension, so as you can see, you do not see any extension here related to SQL. So when you enable discovery DBs, so it will push an extension which I explained in the beginning of this video. So this will take some time, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. So let's wait for this. So the deployment is completed now. So let's select configure backup. So here under backup policy, so either we can choose the default policy or we can create our own. So in this case, I'm going to create our own policy. So I'm going to name it as test backup policy. So this is again full backup, so we can set the backup frequency. So I'm going to select daily backup, which is around 10 o'clock, and the time zone will be set to Abu Dhabi. I'm not going to enable weekly or a monthly backup or yearly backup. So this is again based on your requirement. Since it is a demo lab, I'm just enabling daily backup, and I will keep the daily backup for 7 days. And then I'll click OK. And again, differential backup, either you can enable or disable it. So I'll keep it be default. Log backup, so this is again you can choose based on your requirement. So I'll keep it default. So I'll keep OK, and rest everything as it is. So here SQL backup compression, this is make sure you enable your compression here, so that it will save the storage space. And that's it. We can click on OK, and then it will ask for the database. So we need to add the database here. So to add the database, we need to click add. So and then it will display the SQL server details here. So if you expand this, you will see all your database. So this is my database I'm going to enable for the backup. Similarly, if you have multiple database, you can select as it is, and then I'll click on OK. So now we have added the database as well. The final part is to enable the backup. So I'll click on enable backup. So this will take some time, so let's wait for this. So the deployment is completed now, so we are all set. So let me go back to our recovery service alt, and then we have backup over here. As I mentioned, backup item, so count is 1, which means we have added one server for the backup. So if you see here, the initial backup is pending because our backup will start at 10 p.m. So currently it is 9:44, so it not triggered the first backup. So what we can do, we can forcefully create the backup now. So to do that, we will hit on backup now, and then we'll enable the compression, and let's keep as it is, and then click OK. So this will trigger the backup. So let's wait for this. So at the same time, if you go to your virtual machine, so if you refresh the extension blade over here, you will see Azure Backup Windows workload extension. So basically, this is responsible for all the backup activity of the database inside the virtual machine. So since the backup is going on, if you wanted to see the progress, you can go to the backup job. So if you go here, there is an option called backup job. So this will tell you all the information what is going on. So currently the backup is in progress. So once backup is completed, you can see status as completed over here. So the backup is completed now. So you can go back to the backup item and verify here as well. So let me select the SQL database in Azure VM, and then if you see here, backup status is healthy. So if you click on view details, so here you can see the full backup. So this is the time at which it has taken the backup. So now let's do one thing. So now I'll go back to my virtual machines. So this is my virtual machine over here. So if I try to refresh this database, and if I go to my SQL database, which is Citrix DB, and if I go to properties, as you can see, the last backup was at 5:47, which is in UTC time. So if you add 4 hour, it will be 9:47. Okay, so this is how we can configure backup for our SQL DB in Azure virtual machine. So now I'm going to delete the Citrix DB, and then we will perform the restore activity. So I'll right click and I will click on delete. So now the DB has got deleted. So now I'm going to the Azure portal. So I'll go to the backup center. So under backup center, I'll click on restore. Okay, so data store type, so SQL in Azure VM, and the backup instance. So we need to select which DB we wanted to restore. So here, this is my DB, which is Citrix DB. So let's select this one, and then the restore region. Since I have selected a locally redundant option while creating my recovery service alt, so it will only give primary region. If you have selected zone or geo region, then it will select the option to select another region or another zone. So let's go with this option now. I'll click on continue. So here we have three options: alternative, original, and restore as a file. So first, try to check the alternative location. So I will keep the subscription target value and the server instance and the restore DB name as it is. So basically what it will do, it will try to create a new DB with this name. So let's try this option first. So here restore point, it will ask on which restore point you wanted to restore the DB. Since we have only one recovery point, so I'll select this one and I'll click OK, and then I'll click on advanced configuration. So I'll keep as it is, and I'll click OK here as well, and then I will click on OK. So now it will trigger the restore job. So in order to see the progress, so you can go to backup jobs and you can monitor your restore job over here. So it is currently in progress, so let's wait for some time. So now the backup job shows that restore is completed. So now we'll go back to the virtual machine and we'll see. So let me refresh the server over here. So let's expand the database. So as you can see, Citrix DB restored. So it means that it is restored as a separate DB over here. So now let's try to let's try to restore it in the original location. So I'm going again back to the backup center, and then I'll go to the restore option. So let's select the same DB, which is Citrix DB, and then we'll go back to the next option, which is continue. And here we will select original location now, and then we will select the restore point, and then we'll under the advanced configuration we'll keep as it is, and I'll click OK. So again it triggered the restore job, so we can see the progress over here. So let's wait till it completes. Once it is completed, then we can again come back here and we can check the status. So now restore option is, so now restoration is completed, as you can see over here. So let me go back to the VM and we will see our DB. So here in the DB server, so let me refresh this. So if I expand database, so as you can see my Citrix DB, this has got restored now. So now we have already tested alternative location and the original location. There is one more option here, restore as a files. So let's try that. So I'm going to the restore option once again, and I'll follow the same procedure what we have done earlier. So I'm going to select the DB, and then we'll continue. And here under restore option, so I will select restore as files. So this will ask the path. So here we need to give the path. So I will give a path as ctemp. Okay. So then under restore points, I'm going to select a restore point, which is this one. So let's click on OK. So now it triggered the backup. So now it's triggered the restore. So we can see the progress under backup jobs. So as you can see, restore, which is in progress status now. So let's wait for this. So now the restore process is completed. So let's go back to the virtual machine and see drive temp location, and we'll see whether it's got restored as a files. So as you can see, I'm already here in the C temp. So as you can see, our database got restored as files. So this is how you can make use of Azure Backup for SQL DB, and you can restore as per your requirement, either to the same location or as an alternative DB, or you can restore it as a files as well.